Hi everyone, welcome to the second video of the series for REST Web Services using Java and Spring Boot by Java Tech Booster. In this video, we are going to explore REST Web Services in terms of coding, and we will develop a full-fledged REST API using Java. The purpose of creating this video for me is to show you how to develop an end-to-end full-fledged API from scratch in a step-by-step manner so that anyone can follow this and build their own REST API. So get ready and follow me along until the end of this video. This tutorial need a prerequisite of your Java basic understanding as well as basic knowledge of Spring. But as I have told before in my first video on REST, even though if you are new to Java, don't worry and follow me along to get a detailed understanding of REST API in terms of coding as well. Talking about the takeaway of the session, after this video, you should be able to have a command to develop a full-fledged REST API using Java and Spring Boot. We will also see the execution of API using Postman as well as packaging information. I have already provided one video on part 1 to give you an overview on REST Web Services understanding. If you have not watched that video yet, I will recommend you to go through that once to have a clear understanding on the various concepts of REST. With that, let's talk about the content specific to this video. We will see the resources and technologies used to prepare this project. We will create a Spring Boot project from scratch. We will create the various components like controller, service, and DAO, which will actually give you a glimpse of three-tier architecture in a real-world example. We will see how we can set up a S2 database. In this case, I have used embedded S2 database just to give you a real-time example. In a real world, we will definitely not use this S2 because we will have our community database available in our project. But in this case, I have used S2 as an embedded because it's by default provided by Spring Boot. Then we will see the execution and testing using Postman. And at the end, we will talk about the packaging. Talking about the resources and technologies, we are going to use Java 8 version in this, as well as we will use Maven as a build tool. We are going to utilize Eclipse for our coding and Tomcat web server and H2 database. These two will be provided by Spring Boot as an embedded, and so we don't need to install this additionally in our system. Apart from that, we will also use Postman. If you have set up this environment in your system, then you are all set for your further coding. If you haven't done that yet, please follow my video on Java environment setup for REST API. In the description, I have provided the link for this tutorial. With that, let's quickly jump into creating our first REST API project. So, in this video, I'm going to show you how we can create a project using Spring Initializer. Please note that there are various ways that you can create your Spring project, but in this case, I am going to show you via Spring Initializer. So, if you go to this start.spring.io, all these options will be provided to you in the home page. Like the project will be a Maven project. We have an option of choosing whether if I want to use Gradle, but in this case, I'm going to use Maven. And the language will be obviously will be Java, and the default Spring Boot version will be 2.2.6. I'm just going to use the default one which is provided here. The project metadata, The group name will be com.example and the artifact I'm going to use as REST API. This is just to uh, give a meaningful name of our packages in our project. So the package name here comes as com.example.rest API. If you want, you can give some other name as well, which is suitable for you. The packaging information as shown here, the jar is by default selected, but if we want, we can choose for as well. And the Java version here taken is 8. Talking about the dependencies on the right hand side, there are various library that we would need in order to kick off the coding for this project. The first thing that we would need is Spring Web. So this is needed for our RESTful web services in order to handle the HTTP request. So for all the Spring MVC concept, this library is mandatory. The next thing that we would need is H2 database. As I have already informed, this is something which is by default provided by Spring Boot as an embedded thing. So we are just going to utilize that for now. The next thing that we will use is Spring JDBC. So with that, we have basically provided all the different dependencies which we would need to build our REST API project. Now on click of this generate, this will basically create a compact project on Spring Boot and it will be in zip format. So once you click on this generate, it will create a project with a very little information, and from there you can take it forward for your coding. You have to extract that file and then we are going to import that in our Eclipse project. So the way you can pull your project into Eclipse is you have to go to File, Import, and select existing Maven project, click on Next and provide it in this root directory. Once you do that, it will load the pom.xml file and you can select it and click on Finish. In this case, since I have already exported it, it's not allowing me to click on this because it says project REST API is already imported into the workspace. So I am going to cancel it since I have already exported, and this is the folder structure which is by default provided. Now, as a next step, there are a couple of things that we should notice before we start with the coding in REST. There is something called pom.xml which is provided here by default, and there is one application called REST API application which is again termed as Spring Boot application provided here as a home class. So let's look at this pom.xml first. So this pom.xml has this parent information which gives that detail about Spring Boot parent version, and the version is 2.2.6 which was provided into this screen. This version is very important in the sense that if you go down, then there is a dependencies section where all the dependencies are basically added. As you can see, there are 3 dependencies here which is added right now: Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, Spring Boot Starter Web, and H2 database. And all these 3 we had selected from this dependencies list. But if you notice one thing, we have provided a Spring Boot Starter Web, but we have not provided which version of jar that we should basically pull. So this version is basically aligned with 2.2.6. So that is the importance of this parent version. Whatever jar that we provide here, we don't specify the version, rather we'll just tell Spring, okay, please provide me the jar for Spring Boot Starter Web, and whatever version they have for this release, they will provide us in the lib path. There is one minor change that we would need here. So we are going to use Spring Boot Starter JDBC. Earlier it was a data JPA, which we are not going to use in this project. I'm going to create another video on Spring Boot Data JPA, where I will show you how you can create your REST API using JPA as well. But for the first phase, we are going to stick with Spring JDBC. Another thing to notice here is the version which is provided here is 1.8. Remaining all we can ignore for the time being. Now let's come to the next thing, which is REST API application. So this is the main application for this project, which is a kind of entry point, because we can see the main method, and main method is always considered as an entry point for a Java application. But the special part here, inside this main method, there is something called Spring application.run. Now if you just read this first line, then it clearly says that this class is basically to run your main Spring Boot application. What that means is, so if you have worked in the earlier version, I mean the earlier Spring, then you would know the pain of having lot of prerequisite, the configuration thing that we have to do in order to run a complete Spring project. But in Spring Boot, they have bootstrap a lot of things that we do not need to worry about them individually. What we have to do is we have to just provide this annotation, and internally Spring is going to take care of all those configurations changes. So for the time being, now consider that when we are running this Java class, it will initiate the project which is completely based out of Spring, and internally this is going to control and scan the entire project based on the properties that we provide. And I'm just going to add a console message here. So now talking about the further coding for REST API. So my purpose of giving this demo is to show you one sample REST API where we are going to enable a cart API, and whatever operation that user would need, we are going to implement that. What that means is we are going to provide the various CRUD operation. We are going to fetch the complete cart details, which will give me the item details associated with that cart. We can add item details to that particular cart. We can modify and we can delete it. So the first thing that I'm going to create is the cart details. For that, I just need a sample class file which will give me, I will give this name as cart item and finish. So this is going to be the main data that we are going to transact from one place to another. Let me just quickly add the parameter to this. Yeah, so this cart item will have three fields: ID, which is item ID, name means item name, and then item price. I have given the data type as int, string, and int just to make it more simple. But in a real world, definitely we will have much more complex data transactions, and the Java class might be much more complex than this. But just for the simplicity, I have taken this basic example. Now there are a couple of things that I am going to create. If you right click on this class and under source, you can see generate, getter, and setters. If you select all and just click on generate, it will generate the getter and setter methods which we would need to fetch the data for this Pojo. The next thing that we would need is under source, we will create a constructor using field. So we have created a constructor. Now our Pojo class is basically created. So now let's jump into the next thing. We are going to create another class which will be controlling the entire transaction for this cart. I will name this class as cart controller, and this is going to be my entry point for all the rest related transaction. So in order to make this class as a REST controller, there is something called REST controller annotation. So this REST controller annotation is basically comes from org.springframework.web, and this makes this class as a REST class. So by default, all the behavior which is needed and which is expected, this class can pertain all those things. Now the next thing is, so what I want to do is basically for this particular class, I want a URL pattern that needs to be matched. Like if I say like I want to fetch this controller data, so I have to map some of the URL pattern to this class, right? If I go to this, suppose my URL slash uh, something like cart, okay, slash get cart details. If I type this, so what I want is I want my URL mapping to be configured to be landed to this particular REST controller. So in order to do that, the first URL pattern that I have given, which is cart, I want that to be mapped to this class. Similarly, whatever method that inside I put, all the next URL pattern has to map some of those methods into that. So let me just quickly show you. If I want to create a method, okay, so this class is going to be a get method for me, which will just fetch all the item details under that cart. So the annotation which is needed here is get mapping, and the URL pattern I am putting as slash get. Okay. Similarly, similarly, I am going to create a separate method to add card details, which will be add and update card details, and next will be delete card details. So it will be update and next will be delete. Now, one thing if you notice, in the first method, which was a purely a get details, I use that get mapping. But in the second method where I want to add the card details, so what I would need to add the card details, I would need the the cart item details, and I have already created a Pojo class for this, a Java class for this pertaining to these parameters. So in the controller, I have to expect a request which will send me, which will give me the card details which I can save to my DB. So I have to expect the cart item which I can save it to the DB. Now since this is a request parameter, there is one annotation called request body, which I have to assign to this property, which indicate that this is part of the request body. Similarly, in order to update the cart details, again I would need the cart details which we have to update in the DB, which is already there, but we need to update based on the details. So I would need a cart details here. Okay, and the last thing, to delete. So in order to delete the cart details from the DB, I don't need item or price, I mean the name or price. I just need the ID, which is a unique identifier for each item. So I will just expect a ID to come. Now that ID is of type int. Okay. Now this ID is going to come as a URL pattern in this case. So what I am doing here is I'm saying send me the ID that you want to delete along with the URL itself. So after that there will be item ID coming in and I have to map it, and based on that I have to delete it. So there is one annotation for this, something called path variable. Okay. Now another thing that if you notice, in all these methods I have just used the single annotation called get mapping, which is not right, correct? So there are various REST method: get, put, post and delete. So this add will come into your post mapping. Okay, I have to import this. So it's now imported with this class. Then this will be a modify, which is nothing but your put mapping. Again I have to import this from web bind annotation, and the last will be delete mapping. So I have to again import this from. So if you see, all the mappings have been imported: delete, get, post and put. Okay. Now another thing which is important in this case, like in a real world, even like if you want to connect with DB, you want something like a data object layer which will actually talk to DB for your behalf, right? We cannot directly ask my controller to talk to DB. I mean, technically you can do that, but this will not be a good coding standard. So I am going to create one DAO layer component which will actually talk to DB on our behalf. I will name this as cart repository. In order to work this component as a DAO layer, there is one specific annotation which is something called repository. This is termed as a data access object. Okay, and in order to act this class as a data access object, we have to use this annotation so that we will be allowed to use the various Spring JDBC related component inside of this class. As I've already told in the beginning, we are going to connect with DB in this project using Spring JDBC. So there is a Spring JDBC provided class which we are going to use in this project, and this is called JDBC template. And this is coming from your JDBC core class. So I have to import that class in this import statement. Now, if I want to use the various method of this class, I have to create the object for this, right? And in Java, what is the basic way to create an object? Using new keyword, but there is another way which is provided by Spring. What when we want to use the method inside this class, so we have to create the object, right? So in order to use those method, in this case we are not going to create that object, rather than we are going to ask Spring, I want the object of this class, please provide it to me. So there is something called auto wired concept, which is something very popular, and we are going to use this. So what will happen this is, so what will happen when we provide this at the auto wire, Spring is going to create the object of this JDBC template, and it will keep this in the bean factory, and it will auto wire the object of this JDBC template with this cart repository. What that means is we are allowed to use this in our class. So with that, let's just create our first method, which will give us the cart details, and we are not expecting any parameters, so there is no parameter provided inside this method. I will just use one of the method in this case. Okay, so first thing that we have to provide is the SQL. Now what is the SQL in this case? We want to fetch all the details for this cart item. So obviously select star from, and the table name I'm going to keep as carts. Okay, now this result of this is going to come as result set and the row number. Okay, so what we are going to do is, for each result that we are going to set that into our Java class, which is cart item. So I'm going to map the each result of this select query into this cart item, so that multiple items will be easily set into this cart and it can be returned from this method. Okay, and what I need to provide here is, now notice what is this ID, name and price. This ID, name and price will come from this query output, which is stored into this RS, which is result set. So we have to provide that result set ID in place of this. So if I do rs dot get int, and if I provide the column name, so this ID is my DB column name, so that I'm fetching this and passing this cart item constructor. So if I go to this, so this is the constructor which is going to be utilized in this case. So whatever ID, name and price I'm going to pass, it will set that into the property class and it will be setted into the object. So ID is setted. Now next is name. Again the next is get int, which is price. So this is the column level. Okay, with this we are done with creating one of our DB layer method, get card details. Now if I return this class, then it's saying change method return type has to be list of cart items. So since we are getting multiple lists of this cart items, so the return type has to be changed with list of this cart items. Okay, next method that we would need is add cart details. Okay, and this will actually need my cart item details, so I will expect that as a parameter. Now again I will use this JDBC template dot. Now there is one method which is inside this, is called update, which we can use for both insert as well as update case. So I am going to provide the query to insert the record, which will be insert into my table name, which is cards in this case, and then I will provide the various column of this, which is ID, name, and price. ID, name, and price, and the values is something which will be provided as a parameter. So I am going to provide that as a parameter. Now, what is the first parameter that we are passing to this is get ID. Similarly, the second parameter is get name. So the third parameter is get price. Okay. Now we have to return the result. So in this case, it will just return the number of query which is affected from this. So that which is int. With that, we are also done with the add card details. Let me just quickly copy paste to create the update as well. So the another method we would need is update card details, which will again expect the cart item to be provided. Only the query will change in this case. So what we would need is update cards set name is equal to, we are going to pass this as a parameter, where ID is equal to, we are going to pass this as a parameter again. So what is the first parameter that we are passing is name, and the second parameter is get ID, right? We are done with this as well. The last method that we are going to write into this is delete cart details, and we are just expecting an ID to be passed here. So in this case, the method would be again same, it is going to be update only, the query part which is going to be same. So delete cards where ID is equal to this. Now since we are directly getting the ID, we can simply pass that as a parameter. Now we have already done with all these repository methods: get, add, update, and delete. Now we have controller methods and we have our DAO layer created. We can directly call this repository class component from this controller. But as I have told, it is not suggestive to directly call all of your DAO component from your controller. So there is one component that comes in between of these two, which is something called service layer, where we code all of our business logic. Like in the world of microservices, if you have 10 REST web services in sequence is going to execute, and you want to pass the output of one to another, so in that case there could be multiple logic that you have to code and you have to build in order to fetch and send the response back, or in order to call the DB. First you have to call in the REST web services. So all those things and all those logic you can easily implement into the middle layer, something called as service. So I'm just quickly going to create that component, which is cart service. Okay, just a small type. So this class is going to work as service for me. Okay, now this service will be my middle layer. I want to use this service. I mean, I need to call all the repository methods from this service class. I have to basically use the object of cart repository into this, and I have to pass it on so that I can call the method of cart repository, right? So this is the similar way that we use the object of JDBC template into this repository. Similar way, I would need the object of cart repository into this service class. Okay, so I have to just auto wire. Okay, so I am just quickly going to copy the method which I have already created in controller. Okay, into this service class, but I don't need, let me just maximize this. So I don't need all these mapping to be available because I'm going to call this from controller. This is not my entry point, so these mapping is already defined, so I have to remove that. Yep. Now, so what is the method that is there for get card details? It's already there, get card details, right? I just utilize this. Now if I return this, so it's expecting me to change the return type, which is fine. Then the next thing is card repository. Then what is the method for add card details, which is expecting a cart item to be passed. Now what is the return type? Is integer. Similarly for card details, update card details, again cart item needs to be passed and the return type has to be int. Okay, now let me just remove this request body which is not needed. So the next thing, the last thing basically to delete is delete card details by id. Again it will expect a return as int. So now we are done with our service layer implementation as well. But just to mention once again, here I am directly calling my DAO layer methods inside the service without any business logic. But in a real world scenario, definitely we are going to have much more complex logic, and this is the main focus area that everybody does. Now let's come to the main entry point. So I want to call the method of this cart service from controller. So again I need an object, so I will ask Spring to take care of this object creation. I'll just auto wire this details. So service, return this service dot get card details. This is done. Return type has to be changed. Then again if I go to this card service, then add item and the return type has to be int. Similarly service dot update and the return type has to be int for this as well. Last thing is service dot delete by id and the return type has to be again int. Yes, so with this we have done with our coding. Now we are going to quickly jump into the our DB setup. Okay, so just to summarize, what we did is in the controller we have created our request mapping for this particular REST controller as cart. We have created 4 methods. One is to get, another is to post, third is to update, and another is to delete the cart details. And similarly we have coded the service layer and the respective cart repository. Now, in order to set up our DB layer, if you notice in the resources there is application.property file provided. So this is the property file which we can use for our configuration changes. So as I have already mentioned, we are going to use S2 database. So let me just quickly provide some of the configuration changes that we are going to do for this project. So since I have already copied those configuration details, let me just put it here in the properties file. So this is the mainly the configuration that we are going to use in this project. So the URL which I have just provided is with the name of java take booster underscore db and the username and password, and the console path is s2.console. In the real world, you have to provide your project DB details into this rather than your embedded S2 database parameters. Now with that, let me just quickly start our project. If I do run as a Java project, so it will launch REST API application in the console as you can see. So the app is now started. So if I go down and see, it is started on Tomcat and the port number is 8080. So the default port number which is provided by Spring Boot is 8080. You can change the port number, but for the time being I'm just going to stick with whatever is provided by default. Now let's quickly jump into localhost 8080/h2 console. So this is the console which is provided by Spring Boot based on the configuration which we just edited. So the URL path for S2 is s2-console, which I have given here. Okay, as you can see, the JDBC URL is taken from the properties file, username is Java, and the password is again Java for this. So I'll just click on connect. So now the UI for S2 database is all set. Now let's quickly jump into the query. I will just so I have copied the query just to save time. So I'm just going to create a sample table in this case, which is cards, and then I will insert one sample record. So I have inserted one record. If I do select a star from cards, so it shows one record from the DB which we have just inserted. With that, our DB is all up. Now let's move into the execution of these API. For that, I will use Postman. So this is my Postman where I have created 4 sample test scenarios to test those methods. So the first one is cart.get. So in my controller, cart.get means this should be my first fetch methods to fetch the cart details. So right now in the DB there is only a single record with ID 2. So let's run this and see if we are getting the same value from the DB or not. Yes, see, we got this, right? Now go to the add. So this is my add method and I have to correct this parameter card.add, and the request type will be post. In the header, the key will be content type and the value will be application/JSON. In the value, I have provided this ID is 2 already created, so I will just use some other item. So I will use item ID 1, item 1 and price 100. If I click on this, see it's returned 1, which is number of rows which is impacted. So if I again go and select this, it returned me this 2 items. Let me just quickly go and add more. So if I add one more item with id 3, and if I go to this, return me all those 3 items. Okay. Same we can verify from the DB as well. If I want to this, so there are 3 items has been inserted, 1, 2, 3. So we have successfully tested this first 2 methods. Now let's go and check for the update. Okay. So if I go to this put, so the method type is put and the URL pattern will be cart/update as per my controller, and header will be content type, and the value will be application/JSON, and the body will be 2 updated item and 150. So if I run this, it returns 1. Now let me go and check. So the item, as you can see, the item in this ID2 is updated with updated item 2. The last property that we are going to test is delete. So delete method type, and we are passing the item ID as the path variable with the URL. If I hit this, so it returns once, which is deleted. Again, if I go back and search, 3 is not here. And same I can verify from the DB as well, 3 is not here. So we have successfully tested all these 4 methods for this developed in REST API. So with that, we have come to the end of this execution, and I hope now you got some basic understanding how you can develop a REST API and what are the different methods you can utilize to the real world scenarios. Now I have already committed my code to my GitHub repository, and the link for the same is provided in the description. You can go ahead and download to compare the code that I have just shown. What next is, we are going to talk a lot more thing about REST API, like how you can implement logger thing in your REST web services, how you can implement Swagger in your REST web services, how you can deploy your web services into app server like IBM WebSphere. Again, calling how you can call one REST web services from another. One last thing that is pending from my side is the packaging thing that we discussed in the beginning that we will explore in the end. So right now, if you notice, there is one target folder into this project and there is nothing right now into this. If I go to this project and under this run as, there is a maven build command. Okay, if I do a clean package and click on run, it will basically clean and package the entire bundle of this REST web services and put it into the target folder. So now since the build is successfully completed, as you can see in the console, now if I go to this target and refresh, see the jar is basically, the package bundling is basically created and it is placed in form of the jar. So wherever you want to deploy your code for this application, you can just copy this jar and place it over there. There are different ways that you can create your bundling in terms of war as well, which we are also going to see in my upcoming tutorial. So for this video, I think that is in the scope for now. If you want to learn how you can basically bundle up your REST API in terms of war, please watch out for my upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more Java tutorial videos. Thanks for your support.